But before we begin, I just really want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which we're all meeting today. And I know we're all in different parts of Australia, but I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So thank you for being here today. My name is Lauren Gray. I'm a compliance specialist at Gray Management Systems. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of who we are at the beginning, but let's just quickly go through some little housekeeping about what to expect over the next sort of 40 minutes. So I'll give you a quick introduction into myself, who I am, and working in the NDIS space. We're then going to talk about, obviously, we're going to talk about orientation and inductions today for NDIS providers. So I'm going to talk about the human resource requirements that are on registered providers. And I take that information from the practice standards. So it just sort of sets the scene about what are those mandatory requirements if you're not already aware of. We're then going to talk about planning for induction and orientation. And then we're going to cover some key topics. So some of those things will be things that you absolutely have to demonstrate that you are informing your staff on. And then there's some other issues from an auditor point of view, when I've been going in, and from a training point of view, consulting with certain clients, what I've seen when there's been incidents that have unfolded, when there's been complaints made, sometimes when we've gone back and done root cause analysis into why those things actually occurred in the first place, a lot of the time it was because there was a lack of understanding and education and something that could have really been dealt with appropriately from the very beginning when we've had new staff on board. So that's really important. We're then going to talk about records, so really demonstrating how you can show that you are meeting the requirements of the human part of the human resource standards, requirements of the NDIS practice standards. And then I'll give you some further resources which will come to you via an email following the webinar. Not today, because I just want to go through and check my spelling, but it'll go out to you on Friday. So thanks again for being here. And look, yeah, please talk to me in the chat box. It's a little bit nerve-wracking being behind the screen for 40 minutes wondering if people are here. But look, all questions are really welcome. If you've also got any information that you'd like to share, or any experiences or examples of anything that we're talking about, maybe some things that have really worked for you in your organisation, please feel free to share that. If you're disconnected and you're not really sure about how these webinars attend, you can just click the link again as well. So, all right, so Gray Management Systems, we are a registered training organisation. So like providers, we are also regulated by the Australian Skills Quality Authority. So we also have to go through the audit process. We also have to comply to our own set of standards. So I feel you, and it is just part of business. So our bread and butter really is about compliance training. So helping people understand compliance obligations from a really wide variety of sectors. So we have clients ranging from aviation to health, disability, obviously, aged care, even moving away from the human service standards into the more other industries such as transport, construction, rail safety, you name it. If there's, pretty much every single industry, every sector, if there is a need to meet or demonstrate compliance, which there is here in Australia for businesses, then we assist people identifying what those compliance obligations are, and then how they can maintain compliance and continuous improvement in their businesses. We also have a diploma of auditing on scope, and one of our probably most popular course is our internal auditing training. And then with me coming on board a couple of years ago, I come from a disability background. And so my passion is helping providers working in the health and human service areas, in particular the NDIS. So I have a range of training packages talking about the practice standards and demystifying what those compliance obligations mean, incident management training specifically to the NDIS as well. And we also have some new training, privacy and confidentiality and professional boundaries as well. So just to let you know that I am a current auditor. So I work as a freelance for several other certification bodies out there, including approved quality auditors in the human services area, specialising in the NDIS. And I'm currently now working on a few other standards as well, including quality management standards as well, ISO 9001. So as I said earlier, I am a former disability worker. I actually started out in the field when I was a teenager, volunteering my time before moving to paid work as an outreach worker. Then became a police detective and spent 20 years doing a few different roles. Predominantly, I was a detective, and so I'm very experienced in responding and managing critical incidents, but also investigating and assisting people who have been impacted by highly sensitive and complex cases. So, like as you see on the screen, family violence, mental health, child abuse, adult abuse, sexual offences. And also I worked in some areas for many years, really supporting those vulnerable persons that had been victims of crime, and that included people with disability. So where I sit now as an NDIS auditor and trainer, I really love my work, and I'm really passionate about helping providers, do a really great job out there and support their staff who are amazing. I have to say, as an auditor on audit, my two favourite jobs are speaking to participants and speaking to staff, because there's just some great people out there doing some excellent work. So let's get on to the topic of the day. We're going to talk about orientation and induction. Initially, when I was thinking of topics, I always try and select areas where I see my clients have had issues, or there's problems that need to be solved in their businesses, or they're looking for ways to improve. And like I said, we've had a couple instances now where I've been helping clients do some root cause analysis around to why there's been systemic issues in their business to do with service delivery, complaints and incidents, and we've linked it back to, not a formalised induction process and a lack of training and understanding. So this is taken from the practice standards in relation to human resources. So all providers must have an orientation and induction process in place for their staff. And they obviously, staff need to complete the mandatory NDIS worker orientation program by workers. Providers also need to be able to ensure that they provide training and education to ensure their workers are meeting the needs of participants. And then we also need to provide supervision, support and resources so that they're available to workers to support that, relevance to support delivery, I should say. So it is generic, and it obviously needs to be specific to your organisation. So I'm going to mention some topics today that you might think, well, that's actually not really relevant to what we do, because we are in the game of manufacturing, disability aids or mobility devices and things of that nature. But there'll be other things that will be absolutely relevant to you and not relevant to other providers who are doing maybe more traditional service delivery, and caring for participants. So this, I will caveat in saying that this is more an information session, take it or leave it. And I really hope that you find something, that's of value to you and your business. So orientation versus induction, like really at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, but I just thought I'd mention induction traditionally is it's a short-term event. It's generally conducted on the first day. And it's a great opportunity to really welcome that person into our organisation, giving them the overview, of who is everyone, where does everyone fit in, and even for smaller organisations or, 3-person, 2-person shows, it's still a really important process to have that welcoming moment, maybe taking someone out for a coffee, having a meal with them, a morning tea, whatever it is, or it might be something a little bit less informal too, so that's okay. It's really important on that first day. Generally, you see that it's quite tailored to the role as well. And although all the information can't possibly be loaded onto one person in a short amount of time on that first day, induction really is about getting that key message out, key information. So it might be starting off with safety, accessing the premises, privacy, things of that nature. It might be some immediate safety checks that need to be done as well. And then moving on to orientation, this can also occur at induction. If you're a smaller provider and, there might not be too much more that you need to really explain to people. but it also could be an ongoing process. And for larger organisations, we often see there might be actually a day of orientation. It might be split up over several days, over several weeks, to ensure, that people are up to speed and know what they need to know to be able to do their jobs confidently. So again, that's really more of a deeper dive into the organisation, key policies and procedures, more information around that, forms, templates that are expected to be used, maybe some training in relation to the relevant IT systems. Again, it could be a single information session or broken down into key areas, and it might be site-specific, role-specific, or just some sort of general orientation package. Again, it is up to you as providers to work out what's the best fit for your organisation. But remember, whatever you do, absolutely document, and we'll talk about recording that at the end, so that's important too. All right, if there are any questions, I can't see the chat box. I think we're good at the minute, so just please let me know if there's anything. So it's important that, especially for new providers, if you're starting out or you've had rapid growth, which we're seeing a lot of NDIS providers experiencing currently, it's really important to plan. It's an important part to make sure we get right. And obviously, again, it's going to depend on the size, the complexity of, who you are as a business, your specific risks associated with your service and support delivery. So it is important to have a think about what is actually appropriate to us. What are the key messages that we absolutely are non-negotiables for some of our staff? For some providers, there will be no client interface until certain things have been met in terms of training and awareness and all the rest. And other things, it might be on-the-job training, and that's actually okay too. So it really is up to you. Whatever you do, have some planning around it. So when to consider, well, what topics do we cover? Now, you might already have an existing induction process, and that would be really great. It's still a good idea, I would say, every 12 months to maybe 2 years to do an environmental scan, especially if you're in charge of induction, you're working in human resources. It's really important. Businesses are changing rapidly, and I'm constantly seeing that when I go out on audit, and I'm like, what's been happening since we last came out here? And the changes, in some circumstances are quite significant, especially with what we've all experienced over the last 18 months or 12 months with COVID. A lot of our organisations have taken on new roles, have had to fill in gaps where things have dropped away because there hasn't been the support and other funding available. So there's lots of things always changing as well. So doing that environmental scan, what's changed in our organisation? Has there been some major restructure? Have we taken on new registration groups? What are the key messages that we need to ensure that an induction process, our orientation process, is now encapsulating? It's also important to think about our participants. Who are our participants? What are their service needs? What are their individual needs as well? What topics do we need to cover in relation to our participants to ensure that all staff are able to communicate effectively with our participants, make them feel welcome, so on and so forth. Again, that will be specific to your individual service delivery and who you are. And then to think about who are our staff, who are our volunteers, who are our carers, what are their needs? Are they also people living with disability? Are they predominantly from cold communities? What other things can we do to support them to be able to do their role? And then obviously other stakeholder consideration. What are our compliance requirements and obligations? With our audits that are coming up every, so often. It's not just, for many providers in the in NDIS space, it's not just the NDIS standards that they need to meet. There's other standards that are expected of them, funding obligations. There's also the commission requirements and other agencies as well. And it's really important to link this in with your risk management. Have a look, what are your risks? Where have been some of the issues in the past in relation to employees? And what could we do at induction and orientation to really try and close that gap and minimise that risk to our business? So let's talk about, we'll just talk about a bit about delivery, and then we're actually going to talk about what that actually practically means, because I don't know about you, but personally, I really hate it when we just talk about lots of high level stuff, which is also important and absolutely has a time and place. But practically, it's like, what does that actually mean? So before we do that, let's talk about initial communication. So of course, following successful selection, the contract signed, it's really important to have that initial communication, maybe before, someone starts, on their first day. So in providing maybe important safety information, maybe some organisation background, the people, the clients, any background really that they might come. If they're new to the disability area, new to the NDIS, what other information we could potentially give them? And making sure they've obviously completed the NDIS workers orientation module where appropriate. So, and then first day, when induction really starts, and also that could also coincide with orientation. Work health and safety is a huge area. It's like the number one thing that providers and we must do. There's legislation, there's law that says that we absolutely have to maintain a safe workplace. We all know that. So there are many things that are going to be specific, which will depend on sites, programs. Like I've got a whole list here, and this is going to actually be covered in next month's webinar. And I'm actually going to get a safety consultant expert on as well, because we're going to ask some questions, and she's really, really helpful. So if you have any work health safety questions, please direct them to my guest next month. But just to give you an idea, this could be anything from emergency procedures to, obviously COVID safe plans, pandemic responses, things about first aid. Who are your first aiders? Where's the OHS bulletin board? Where's information about where I can access, the fire warden, your OHS or your work health safety representatives, depending on what state you work in, location and use of PPE gear. That's the world that we are definitely living in now. Infection control, as well as all your security procedures. So there we're going to do more of a deep dive next month into all those exciting topics around safety. So and obviously here, a bit of an overview. Of course, you're going to do a bit of a tour of the premises. Hopefully, would hate for anyone to come, and I have been there before, started in a new work group, and there was like no tour, no real formal introduction. I was just there, and it was like, who are you? Really disconcerting and not the best way to start off. So trying to do everything we can to really make that person feel welcome is important. And obviously it goes without saying, at some stage there absolutely has to be a one-to-one discussion in regards to the specific role and responsibilities and expectations relevant to that person and the role that they're stepping into. And that's really flows into the setting of the expectations, who are their direct supervisor or management, those reporting requirements, and letting them know that training and coaching is going to be part of, the orientation and induction process too. So they're important points to cover. So setting expectations, really is important. I think a lot of the time when people aren't sure where, what, I think most people, if they get, they get it. And what am I trying to say? Most people know what's right from wrong, and they get it. But there are still some people that also need to be reminded of what is a professional boundary. And so when we're looking at developing policy or even reviewing policy in regards to organisational wide in terms of what are professional boundaries, what does that mean to us, what are our own code of conduct and ethics and values that we expect that our leadership team is going to lead with, and what we expect our staff to embody as well. This is really important about setting those expectations. And then also feeding that into relevant policies and procedures. Honestly, it is gone with the days where you just give someone policies and procedures and say, read that. Like, there's no follow-up. And I don't know about you, but first day on the job or even afterwards, you've got so much going through your mind that to sit there and just read copious amounts of documentations about policies and procedures with no other context, no other explanation, or even sort of examples of why this is important or how that could fit into their business, that can be overwhelming, and it will generally go in one ear and out the other. So that's why it's important that maybe, as part of an ongoing orientation process, there are some relevant training specifically to some really important topics. Obviously, we need to ensure that our work health safety legislation and those requirements are being met, letting them know what's safe, what's not. If you've got position descriptions or some other format in which you record and document roles and responsibilities, it's really important that they understand that. A lot of the time they're, included in contracts and things like that. So agreements, employment agreements and all the rest of that's covered. And letting them know that you're an NDIS provider. They don't need to know the nitty-gritty of the practice standards, but let them know about that, what it means to be registered and why these certain policies and procedures are in place, not only because we have to in order to pass an audit, but it is to safeguard participants. So therefore, if we detect any breaches, if we detect any non-conformances, if we receive a complaint that a procedure hasn't been followed, then it is actually important. And this is the process of what's expected from you as a staff member. And this is the process of how it will be managed. So education is really key and a great opportunity to set those expectations very, very early on in the piece. So let's get down to the good stuff. So some key topics. Now, these are participant focused because I am coming from a NDIS auditor perspective. So please keep that in mind. This is not the be all end all. So we're going to talk today in a little bit more detail about rights and responsibilities. So rights of participants, responsibilities on providers. We're going to talk about how important it is to set professional boundaries and let people know what is okay, what behaviour is okay and what is not. Professional boundaries can be a tricky area because, and I know through personal experience with family members being an NDIS participant, participants can work with people for many, many years. And in some cases, participants don't even have their own family anymore, and their workers are like their family. So I'm not here to say that, it's not about this is the red line and this is it. We have to just be able to manage that. And just through education, through supporting our staff, we can still do excellent work. And it's also about protecting the participant as well as our staff as well. So I'm just throwing some considerations in there for you to think about. Then conflict of interest. Maybe because of my background, conflict of interest is always at the forefront of my mind, and I see it as one of the biggest risks, aside from a lack of incident management systems and complaints management. But a lot of providers do not identify and they do not manage conflict of interest, whether they're perceived or whether they're actual conflict of interest. And it just not opens up participants to huge risk, but staff themselves and reputational risk for providers. So we'll have a little chat about that too. And then, of course, the complaints management system and incident management system. These are mandatory requirements of the NDIS practice standards, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. And then, of course, there's role-specific things that you're going to identify as, well, this is specific to our organisation, is specific to these the staff that are coming on board. And that's going to vary from person to person, whether they're in an admin role or whether you're onboarding a specialist support coordinator or someone in the exec team. It's going to obviously vary. So, and then just for other thoughts that are more staff focused, and we don't have time, we're not going to go in this today, but these are other areas which I think most providers, sort of have a really good handle on. But it's really important then to sort of set the scene during an orientation process to let employees know what their rights actually are, especially if they're a contractor, a volunteer, or a full-time, part-time employee or casual. It really is important to let them know what their rights are. I think sometimes organisations, I don't know, might shy away a little bit from that, but I really think if you're upfront and transparent from the beginning and you make your employees feel that they know where to go to get help, that they feel like the provider has their back, that I think that it really contributes to people feeling really valued within an organisation, especially large organisations where it's easy for people to sort of wane into the background. Obviously, letting them know what the expectations and what they can expect in terms of supervision, professional development, and performance management as well. Mental health, that's a huge topic. Don't often, I see it really well done in mental health organisations, which is fantastic with their staff. But it is definitely a consideration, and it really links back into our OHS obligations as well, our work health safety obligations. And it is something that we will touch on in the next webinar next month on safety. Of course, bullying, harassment, discrimination. So that's letting people know if they experience those incidents, what they need to do in that moment to protect themselves, to report it, what's the organisational stance in that, zero tolerance to that type of behaviour, and what's the process, how the organisation is going to be committed to managing that and preventing it as well. And also, obviously, how to feedback internally to management and complaints as well. So they're just some other key topics that are more staff focused. And I think it's important to say, because although obviously the NDIS practice standards are very participant focused, I do feel that sometimes providers and their staff feel a little bit left out. So staff are, really important in this space. Really good staff. There's so many wonderful people working in this space, and I think it's wonderful. So it's important that it really needs to be a focal point, part of the orientation process as well. So rights and responsibilities. So part of the practice standards is we absolutely, participants must have their legal and human rights communicated to them in a way that is right for them. Upholding their legal and human rights in all facets of service delivery is important. So that needs to be reflected in the documentation of your business. It's not just about putting that information in the participant handbook and handing it to them. It is, where do we see that in the policy? Where do we see that in the procedures? And then communicating that to staff, okay? I think it's really important to reiterate this. A lot of the time people are going to get it, especially if they've been working in disability for a long time. But I think it's still very important to remind people that your participants have the right to practice their culture, values, and beliefs. They have a right to privacy and dignity. And that's not just about privacy and dignity face-to-face in circumstances with like service delivery. That also extends to confidentiality of personal information, to IT security, things of that nature. So it's a really broad topic that we need to support participants in their right to exercise independence and make their informed decisions. And so what's the process of when we have a new client on board? How do we listen? What is that intake process? How do we establish service agreements in conjunction with the participant or their nominee? So it's really important. There's so many different processes and procedures as you go through that you'll go, oh, yep, these are really important to educate our new staff on. And obviously all participants have the right to live freely from violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, and discrimination. So this links in with your incident management system, which we'll talk soon about. So these are the rights and rights of the participants, I should say, and then the responsibilities need to be communicated. So what is the relevant policies and procedures that you need to communicate with your staff in relation to that? So if they detect something is not right, if they detect that a right has been breached, what is the process? What can they do in that moment to rectify it and manage it as well? So professional boundaries, so important to establish those clear guidelines, like what we say, what behaviour is okay and what's not. Some people still just don't get certain things. I think one of the main things that I don't often see in organisations but is becoming such an issue is social media. Surprise, surprise, it's an issue everywhere. What is your policy? What is your stance as an organisation on social media in terms of how you communicate with your participants, how you communicate with your other clients as well? what is okay, what's appropriate. Now, some participants, they actually may only want to communicate through Messenger. That's their preferred mode of communication. Not a problem. But how are we going to manage that? Is it okay for staff to use their own personal profiles to do that? What's the balance? What if clients start contacting them, staff after hours? How are we going to manage their well-being as well? So there's lots of information. I don't have all the answers to social media because things change so rapidly, but it's absolutely something that if you don't currently have anything, I would absolutely look at that. What is your organisation policy and stance on receiving gifts, the development of friendships, intimate relationships? And I've spelled intimate, always my spell checker comes up with intimidate instead of intimate. What happens if an employee crosses a line and it is, they conduct themselves in a way that breaches the NDIS code of conduct? What if they go that step further and they actually commit a criminal offence? So it's really important to communicate what those boundaries are to your staff, what the expectations are, and what processes are in place to support them to do their role safely and also to protect participants too. Conflict of interest, which we sort of already have gone to, but the conflict of interest essentially is when personal interests and professional duties and responsibilities clash, and we can't make, it prevents us from making unbiased decisions. Essentially can impact that, or it's perceived that we could not make an unbiased decision as well. So all those conflicts of interest must be identified and managed. Now, just because there's a conflict of interest doesn't mean to say that that's a bad thing. It just needs to be managed. It just needs to be kept an eye on. And in some circumstances, we absolutely need to do something about those conflicts of interest. So, information to really provide workers is what to do in the event that they think that they have a conflict. What's the process? Who do they bring that to? Who do they report it to? How are you going to record that organisationally? Do you have a conflict of interest register? Is there a form to fill out? Even providing some examples specific to relevant roles and service delivery that would be appropriate to help understand that context, because it is an area that people sometimes can get a little bit confused with. And sometimes it's not just black and white as well. There is a lot of grey too. I really think that a really good business practice could be at every performance review that you conduct with staff to ask about, are there any conflicts of interest that have arisen since we last met? And if they have, that's okay. Aren't we glad that we know about it? What is it? Let's do an assessment. Are there any risks? How are we going to manage it? Really having these upfront conversations at the very beginning will then also assist staff to have the confidence to come to you, even if they're not sure about something, because you would rather have that conversation to identify potential risks as opposed to them being worried or too scared that they're going to lose their job and then not say anything about it at all. And it does actually become an issue to manage as well. Just some thoughts on conflict of interest. Complaints, as I said earlier, like incidents, a mandatory training requirement. It's really important to teach our staff how can participants make a complaint. What is the process if a worker does receive a complaint from a participant? Who do they report it to? How is it recorded? What is their specific role in the complaint and resolution process? Again, don't just give them the procedure, the policy. It will go in one ear and out the other. Spend some time with them, maybe do a follow-up little training series. Honestly, every sort of, depending on, the risk associated with your service delivery, I probably would absolutely be throwing out some sort of training there every 12 months with your staff, just to give them a top up. This is the process. These are the issues that we've discovered over the last little while. These are the lessons that we've learned as well. And I think it's also equally important to discuss with staff what happens if they become the subject of a complaint or allegation. Like, what's the process, what to expect, how are you going to support them, what is the process? You might not, there might be a judgment around how much information you give them in terms of investigation and things of that nature. but I think it really is important to give information up front. In the event that someone does make a complaint, this is how we manage it. And yeah, I think transparency is absolutely key. Incidents now, if you take anything away from this webinar today, please take this away. Staff must understand what an incident is and what is a reportable incident, because we cannot manage and prevent what we do not know and understand. And on audit, I'm blown away by when I speak to staff, as lovely as they are and excellent as they at their jobs. What is an incident? And they don't really understand, or they don't really know. It's really crucial because in some providers, incidents are few and far between, and in other times, things happen. It's life. Things do happen. So it's important to know and to be able to support our staff about when an incident arises, what is the process, what is the expectation on them in that moment to initially respond to an incident, especially if it's an emergency or it's an emerging, there's a threat or risk. We need to give them that support to be able to deal with that appropriately, to be able to keep themselves safe and everyone else safe, including participants. Who they must report that incident to and how, whether it's a form, an online, form they fill out, something that they that they handwrite, or maybe it is an email for smaller providers. There's nothing, it could just be a phone call as well. Who is responsible for contacting the NDIS Commission about a reportable incident? That's key. That's actually one of the requirements of the practice standards within incident management, about having someone nominated who is responsible for contacting the Commission, because there's time frames. For most reportable incidents, well, for all of them except for one, it's 24 hours essentially. How the incident will be recorded and what's the expectations on supporting those persons who have been impacted by an incident. That's really key. So, and then of course we go into role specific. So this is just a whole heap of information. You guys are probably doing a lot of this anyway, I would hope. So, specific information about your clients, your participants, their individual plans, their service agreements, risks, medications, if that's relevant to that person's role, the type of documentation that you use and the processes in the business, how a client files stored, how a note's updated, use of templates, registers, forms, IT systems. Really important to support people, especially around IT. IT can be tricky. It can even be tricky with people that are a little bit savvy. If they're using a new system, we do need to provide them that support and training in relation to access that. Cultural awareness is really important too. So really, again, looking at who your cohort is, who are your clients, who are your staff, what's appropriate. Disability awareness training, especially for new people that might be coming into the disability sector for the first time, or the NDIS. Using interpreters. This was something that came up in audit a couple of weeks ago. Really important consideration, especially if you are in an area where there's a broad cold community. How are workers, what's the expectation on who can actually translate in that instance? Now, in emergency situations, it's actually okay to get a staff member, maybe a family member or a carer or someone else in that moment to translate. But I would then always recommend following up anything of importance with a translator to make sure that the information as a provider you have communicated to the participant, and the information that you're hoping to receive back from the participant is clearly communicated to you as well. So anything of importance, absolutely book an interpreter. So again, what's the process of that? How to access a telephone interpreter or get an in-person one there too for meetings as well. So that's important information to give our staff. Accessing advocacy services, the importance of advocacy, who are our local advocacy agencies and things of that nature. So, and then role specific, it goes on risk assessments. This is a huge one. Look, I know a lot of trained professionals out there, doing risk assessments all the time, especially, in relation to their roles. But there will be other staff in your organisation maybe that also are expected to do maybe environmental risk assessments. So before they go out and visit a client, doing in-home risk assessments, or program assessments out in the community and things of that nature. You know, we talk about risk a lot, but what actually is it? How do they fill out the forms properly? You know, it's really important to support our staff to conduct these properly. I'll give you, when I used to work in internal audit and risk back in the police force, and we used to expect all the station managers to send in their risks. And I remember at one meeting, it was like the risks weren't actually risks. And that's because they didn't understand what a risk was or how to write one. Again, lack of communication and training, okay? Great at police delivery, great at managing stations and things of that nature. But in terms of actually identifying what those higher risks and strategic risks were, you know, was clearly a gap. So let's educate our people on how to do that properly. There's no point in having templates just for the sake of passing an audit. It's really about supporting and making sure that, you know, reputational risk, client risks to client safety and our staff, they're really important. And again, implementation of BSPs, restricted practices and things of that nature. It's all pretty self-explanatory there. So look, we're sort of almost at the end. I just wanted to say, whatever you do, like with anything, you're doing all this really great work and often we forget to document it. It's really important to document that you are doing an induction and you have an orientation process. So when you do formalise a process, formalise it in terms of a policy with a procedure, maybe have a handy checklist to use to prompt managers and supervisors to do that one-on-one. And as improvements and additions are made, it's okay to retrain your staff, you know, get them on board again. Don't tell them it's the you're reinducting them. But I think when you speak to staff, I always get the sense that they actually appreciate that, you know, the information. They appreciate the new resources. They appreciate the workshops the providers provide for them and things of that nature. So making sure that that's communicated, especially when there's big changes. You know, I don't know how many organisations have gone in lately, but there's been huge restructures with the executive. New position descriptions have been rolled out. Staff are changing positions. People have been promoted. People have left. New people are coming in. There's always a lot happening, and I get that. But once you nail this induction and orientation process, things just can become a little bit easier as well. So yeah. All right. So that is the end. That is the end of our presentation. I can't see any questions. Hopefully it's been helpful. If there's any comments,